What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Mafia: The Old Country, a prequel to the Mafia series that dives into the early 1900s in Sicily and, of course, the origins of the Mafia. Now, before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of Mafia: The Old Country, this review is coming out a little over a week since the game itself initially launched. That is because I did not receive a review key for this one. I did go ahead and pay for it, of course, because I wanted to cover it. However, the other side of that is that it's actually a pretty short game. Like, 100% on this was like a roughly 20-hour endeavor. And that is primarily because most of the game is a relatively linear jaunt through the game's 14-chapter story, and while there is, technically speaking, an open world to explore, there's nothing really there worth doing besides grabbing collectibles, which is going to give you some of the money you need in order to, upgrade your cars or buy different weapons, etc. But honestly, none of that is even necessary because even on hard, this game was not difficult, which brings me to my sort of main overview here. I think Mafia: The Old Country probably would have made a really great movie, but it's mostly just an okay game. The story and the setting, honestly, all pretty good. The actual gameplay is mostly just various stealth sections and some really basic cover shooter stuff, alongside a bit of melee combat that could use some work, and frankly, if you've ever played anything that kind of plays like that, this is, again, at best, an okay rendition. Add some technical problems on top of that, and you're looking at a game that is, in my opinion, just not really worth the $50 I paid for it, even if it was a fun enough experience in terms of the narrative. Though it does make for an easy 100%, I suppose. Moving on from there, let's go ahead and talk about the technical state of this one. Honestly, kind of your typical Unreal release these days. That is to say, Unreal Engine. I had a few crashes, which across 20 hours is not great. We're talking like probably 4 or 5 crashes. There's also, I guess you could call it artifacting in some of the cutscenes. Occasionally you'll see like moving objects just like leaving versions of themselves that fade away over time as they move. And that combined with the usual freezes and stutters that have become kind of synonymous with the engine at this point. And yes, I've read all the articles and things about it. I know what is causing it in terms of like shaders and compilations, but it doesn't change the fact that it keeps happening. So simply put, the technical state of this isn't unplayable or anything, but it could be better, frankly. Next up, let's talk difficulty. There are technically a variety of difficulties for this, but they're all super easy. They have another thing, aim snap type, which will, of course, help you lock onto enemies, I guess you could call it, as you go to target them and things like that. But again, it's just not necessary. If you've ever played any sort of stealth section or cover shooter section on basically any game, you should be golden. It's not hard at all. I'm honestly kind of surprised they bothered with difficulty settings at all, given how unimpactful this was. Next up, let's talk story and my thoughts on it. Though, kind of a big warning here towards the beginning for the sake of spoilers. A big portion of this game is its narrative, and it's very hard to talk about any of that without even what I would consider contextual spoilers. So you may just want to skip this part altogether, because in the case of this game, some of my thoughts I want to share on the story are things I would consider probably at least contextually spoilers if you want to piece things together. So again, skip it if you are concerned about that. Otherwise, though, the story kicks off following our character, Enzo, as he works at a mine. A sulfur mine, to be specific, and they are all but slaves here, under the cruel overseer of the Spardato Mafia. After your friend dies in the escape attempt, but our character manages to make it out, you get saved by the Torrisi family, who takes you in and basically gives you a place to work and focus on kind of getting your life together, and thus begins your initiation into the Mafia, as the vineyards you are working at are in fact just one piece of the Don Torrisi here's holdings in the Valle Dorata. Under the tutelage of your mentor Luca, you're going to learn the ins and outs of how this operation works. You're going to become the Don's most dutiful soldier, become a made man, a member of the family, the typical stuff you would expect from a Mafia game, I suppose. But it gets a little more complicated by a few different things. You're back and forth with the Spardato Mafia, who have not exactly forgiven you for managing to run away and successfully escape them, but also the flirtatious advances of Don Torrisi's daughter aren't exactly making your life any easier, and you are, throughout the course of this game, going to navigate that entire scenario. And that's about as much as I want to say on specific events, but I do want to give a little bit of thoughts on the ending itself, which is going to be vague. I'm not going to go into specifics here, but what I will say is that the ending is rough in a good way. It is, I think, exactly how you would expect someone who is living a life of crime to end their journey, and it's obviously a little more complicated and poetic than me just saying that, but after everything you do over the course of this game, I think getting a truly happy ending would feel wrong somehow, and yet at the same time, I think this game's ending is satisfying in the sense that it's not a perfectly happy ending, but I do think it suits the kind of game that this ultimately is, which is one that sees you choosing to live a very specific life of crime. All in all, though, I really enjoyed the story. The characters are great. Don Teresi definitely has that sort of menacing, uncompromising leader of a criminal organization aura to him. He's surrounded himself by people who are anything from irrelevant to competent and useful like Luca, or overly skeptical and cautious, as one would probably expect from ultimately a criminal. And there's just kind of all shades of what you would expect there across both your family and, of course, that of rival mafias that you see in the game. And I think, despite the game's relatively short runtime, they do a really good job of fleshing a lot of those characters out, which is honestly kind of annoyingly interrupted in between you having to do very basic gameplay things, which is why I kind of feel like this would have made a better movie than a game in particular. But ultimately, playing through this one's going to run you probably 8 to 10 hours, maybe a little more than that if you are trying to get like achievements or specific goals or play on hard mode and that kind of thing. From there, however, let's talk progression systems. There's really only a few, to be honest, and it's mostly acquiring weapons, horses, cars, a little bit of customization in terms of like what your character is wearing alongside like your horse and your cars, that kind of thing. But basically, as you take out enemies, you can loot and find all sorts of things, primarily though denarii, as well as these like coins and stuff that you can sell for more denarii, which you can then spend on having extra weapons, horses, and cars at your beck and call, which are all, of course, of varying usefulness. Now, one thing I did like about the weapons is that, for the most part, they're all useful in different ways. Like, for instance, there's 3 different types of knives, which all have their own mechanics. So while you'll unlock more of that stuff and some customization along the way, that's really kind of all there is. There just really isn't too much game here to progress through besides the story itself. And as a result of that, you can unlock almost everything you would want simply by playing through the story and then spending all the cash you acquired doing that on unlocking like weapons and things like that as you go in the game's Explore mode. Which brings us to the gameplay and world section. So, the primary experience for Mafia: The Old Country is a 14-chapter linear story. There are some moments during this story where you can actually go around and explore the game's sort of open-world hub, but the thing is, there's really not much of a reason to do that, which makes the game's side system of Explore mode, which you can choose through the main menu to go out and explore that hub zone, not really have much to do. Like, there's not like content to find or anything, but rather the primary reason you would probably do it is simply to gather all the collectibles, which could give you some money, and then you could like upgrade your weapons and stuff for missions, I suppose. But as I mentioned, even on hard difficulty, that is not necessary at all. You don't need to do that. And given the game's relatively basic gameplay systems, there's just not a huge reason to invest much at all in that. Now, supposedly, to address this, they've already announced that the game will be getting what they are calling a free ride mode, which is apparently a similar version, which is actually going to include content sometime in the coming months, but I mean, frankly, the game should have launched with that, because it's pretty bare bones as is. Otherwise, though, the primary bits of gameplay are stealth, cover shooter, and knife fights. Now, your knife is going to play a pretty central role in a lot of that, surprisingly, so the game quickly introduces you to multiple different kinds of knives. In particular, there are a bunch of different knives that all fit into 3 different categories, each of them good at different things. One can be thrown, one has more durability or knife sharpness, which means you can take out more enemies stealthily without having to use a whetstone to resharpen that knife. Knife sharpness is also used on doing things like popping open locks to collect loot and things like that, so there's a little bit of that as well. There's also one type of knife that is really good for the actual knife fight segments, because while you can, technically speaking, use melee attacks during the game's like cover shooter sections, that really shouldn't be anything but a last resort, as you'd probably guess, or obviously to make stealth kills, but the actual knife fights that are in the game are basically like a little basic dodge or parry knife fight system you can get into. Enemies will basically make either light or heavy attacks that you either have to parry or dodge respectively. And the thing is, these fights are a little bit janky. They tell you to, of course, either dodge or parry, but the thing is, terrain kind of matters there as well. So if you find yourself backed into a corner, or if the enemy backs themselves into a corner, things like that, the animations can break, things like that. You'll get hit even if you're doing the right thing. So it's not exactly like it's a system that feels particularly great, even if I can see what they were trying to do there. Then you've got your stealth, extremely basic stealth system. Basically, you are going to find cover, stay out of sight of enemies. You have a sort of instinct thing you can activate, which will highlight enemies through walls and cover, that kind of thing, which lets you keep track of them, which makes it extremely easy, combined with the fact that they really don't move very much, to just stealth kill your way through entire compounds without really ever being concerned about being discovered. I found it rarely necessary to hide bodies, but technically you can do that as well. Otherwise, much of the game comes down to its cover shooter mechanics. There are basically small and long guns available to you. That is to say, things like pistols, sawn-off shotguns, or longer stuff like repeaters, pump shotguns, things like that. So basically, just stay in cover and shoot at enemies when they are available to shoot at. You can also distract enemies both in stealth, but also sometimes in these fights it can be useful to do that. You can also throw grenades at them, but again, very basic little combat system, nothing to really write home about here. Outside of those core gameplay elements, there's a couple other things, like for instance, there's a horse race, there is a car race, and you can, drive around in some of these early 1900 vehicles, but other than that, it's basically just collectibles. There's really just not that much going on with this game in terms of gameplay and combat. So you can kind of see what I mean here by like this side of the game being very underwhelming. So like the story is interesting, and that's clearly the main experience. There's really not much to do otherwise, despite them adding this Explore mode, which just doesn't really have anything in it. All of which brings us to our Steam Deck section. So this game, technically speaking, has a not supported rating on the Steam Deck, but I'm not entirely sure why. Seems like more of a playable situation. I will say it is probably because this game's minimum specs are technically a bit above what the Steam Deck has available to it in terms of hardware, but if you utilize graphic settings and things like that, you can definitely get this working and running to a point where, it's playable for sure, even if the FPS dips a bit on you. So I have to say I don't really agree with their unsupported rating on this one, but it is what it is. That brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So on the positive side for me, it was basically the story, the setting, and the characters. I really liked Enzo's journey, and while I think the ending is going to resonate differently with different people, I think it was appropriate for what the story is about. I think a lot of the characters themselves are really well fleshed out. They did a great job of showing the back and forth there, the highs, the lows, the setting itself, seeing this, really beautiful portion of a Sicilian valley in the early 1900s was a great time. I loved that part of it. However, unfortunately, the rest of the game has some problems. You've got the bugs I mentioned. You've got an empty world that really is kind of barren of things to do. And given their announcement of that free ride mode that is supposed to be upcoming in a few months, it really feels like something was missed here. Like maybe they intended that to ship with the game and missed a target or something. But there's something going on there, frankly. Which is crazy given that even the main story definitely has a couple of chapters that are clearly just filler. And then you've got the incredibly basic gameplay elements of the stealth and the cover shooter that, aren't particularly great at what they're trying to do anyway. And that kind of all collectively brings me to my conclusion. Mafia: The Old Country is $50 US, and for me it's a pretty firm buy on sale, and I did in fact pay $50 for this, and I don't feel great about it. This feels more like a $30 or $40 experience at most, and $40's really pushing it. There's a great short story at the center of all this, but it's surrounded by incredibly basic gameplay that feels honestly pretty uninspired in comparison to the story itself, and thus the buy on sale. But that is pretty much everything I've got to say about Mafia: The Old Country. I certainly hope you enjoyed the review. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.